Hi, everyone. In this lecture, I want to talk about risk perception and tolerance in driving and how it relates to driving safety and both the development of driving interventions to increase safety. And this kind of continues on from a theme that we talked about a little bit, got into a little bit last time and the time before when talking about distraction, right? So often when we're talking about how we drive, like the first few lectures when we talked about car following and steering. So we assume that the driver is driving optimally, right? Their main goal is to be safe, right? They're always so focused on the road, they're picking up the right information and so on, right? That is going to lead to accidents if we make that assumption, if we stick our head in the sand and we pretend that we're not human beings, right? So we saw one of the big things last time is people get distracted, right? Driving is boring, right? People are going to want to look at their phone and text and do to deny that fact and pretend that they don't do that is just going to leave more accidents, right? A much better approach that we take in human factors is let's design around the limitations and capacities of human beings. Let's accept the fact that people aren't good at paying attention all the time and create driver warnings. Let's accept the fact. And what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about kind of getting in the emotional side of driving, right? It is a fact that for some people, driving kind of risky is fun, right? Driving fast, driving around corners really fast, zipping in and out of traffic, following closely, even though driving can be super dangerous and everyone knows that you could die in an accident, people still have a little bit of risk they're willing to tolerate because not only because it can be rewarding, right, for people that are kind of the sensation seekers, but also to, we kind of trade off, right? People are willing to trade off safety for getting there on time a little bit. So that's what we want to talk about today, the perception of risk and the kind of related topics as we go. Right. And as I said, the goal is we don't want to deny that people do this. We want to take it into account. So we want to talk about how people perceive hazards, right? And how well people perceive hazards on the road, how well people perceive danger. So when you're driving up to an intersection, how good are you at noticing and to kind of have a feeling that something can be dangerous, right? Well do we assess it? How well do we remember it? What levels of risk are people willing to accept and why? And then we'll get a little bit of emotion and aggressiveness into road rage. To start off with, what I want to talk about is assessing danger in driving. And what we're going to see is we're going to look at some research that has looked at people's kind of ways to assess people's perception of danger. And right, so you could assume when you're in kind of a risky, dangerous situation, your heart rate should go up. Your galvanic skin response is how much you sweat basically should go up. Your subjective appraisal, if I ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, how risky is this? The problem with these things, we have to be a little careful, and hopefully this is something you've heard in psychology before, the problem with correlations, right? And the big thing we always talk about in statistics and psychology is correlation does not imply causation, right? When two things are related, it doesn't mean that one causes the other, right? Um, so a correlation measures, because we're going to look at some correlations, a correlation measures the relationship between two things, right? You can have a high positive correlation, for example, between weight and height, right? We'd expect taller people tend to be heavier. So there's going to be a high positive correlation. It's not going to be perfect, right? Because not every person that's 7 feet tall is heavier than a person that's 6 feet tall, right? So it's not a perfect correlation. So there's going to be usually a lot, but it's not a perfect correlation, okay? So a correlation expresses the strength of a relation, a correlation coefficient between two variables. It ranges between +1 and -1. Um, a correlation between a negative correlation, for example, would be how much you weigh versus how fast you can run, right? You would expect that to be a pretty strong negative correlation. The more weight you lose, the faster you can run, okay? So a positive is they go up together and go down together. Negative is they go in the opposite directions. 0 means there's no relationship at all. The relationship between your weight and the phases of the moon. Maybe some people believe there is, but you would expect very little correlation. So correlation does not imply causation. Just because two things are related, right? There's an image going around I've seen where I should have it. I should put it in here. There's a big a roof that's collapsed, right? And in the point where it's collapsed, there's a cat sitting, right? So the correlation is the cat happens to be sitting where the collapse is. Obviously, the cat did not cause the collapse, right? So two things can be related, but the effect can really be caused by confounding variables. Another good example is race and crime, right? There's a strong relationship between those two things, but it's really not one causing the other. It's the intermediate variable, confounding variable of socioeconomic status that drives that relationship, right? So we have to be very, very careful. That's kind of why I wanted to do that. Another example I like to use is many years ago, people put forth the idea that red wine was healthy, drinking red wine was healthy. A large part of that research was based on comparing the health of people in France and the United States. There's a lot more things different between. I used to live in France. There's a lot more things different between people in France and people in the United States than the amount of wine they drink. So, inferring that one is causing the other, drinking red wine is causing good health, is kind of very dangerous thing to be doing. Okay. So, in cell phone use, here's an example. Initially there was a close to zero relationship between accidents and cell phone use. A lot of that had to do with reporting practices, right? So again, we have to be very, very careful how we interpret these. The only way to demonstrate causation is to do an actual experiment where you manipulate something, you give someone a drug and someone a placebo, and you see how it affects, right? It's not always easy, right? If you gave 100 drivers at random, some a cell phone, some not, and measured their accidents, obviously there's ethical questions, there's issues. So kind of we have to work around these issues in research. Okay. But let's get into the main topic of the day today, assessing how well drivers can assess risk and danger. Okay. So a lot of this work is done by a person named John Groger, who has a wonderful book called Understanding Driving. If you're interested in more of this, it's a bit old now, but it's really good. So he measured skin response and heart rate while driving, and he looked at how it relates to subjective measures. Okay, um, and then he had the people see how the two related. um, he did find kind of the main finding of this slide at the point out is that there is a relationship between your heart rate and your galvanic skin response. So he had people driving around and he was measuring this on the go. When you drive into an area that tends to have more accidents, there is a relationship. So there's some relationship there. People often, there's not that strong relationship between what you rate consciously as dangerous and what these physiological unconscious measures. So we do find that a lot in research like this, right? What people tell you is very different than what they're actually experiencing, right? And that's kind of another example of this is why focus groups often fail, right? People tell what they consciously, explicitly tell you in a focus group about whether they like a product or not may be completely different to what they're actually unconsciously experiencing with it. So this is kind of the correlations you can get. So the relationship between danger and difficulty. So often that's another problem with this is, are people actually rating how dangerous something is or how difficult it is, right? Difficulty, driving through a busy city is difficult. Maybe it's not dangerous. And you can see the correlations are getting up to 0.61, which that's pretty high. None of the correlations in real research ever get up to 1, right? So that's a pretty strong relationship. Okay. So it suggests that some part of your brain, right? If you've taken any kind of neuroscience course, you know that you have some areas in your brain that are really picking up things unconsciously. Some part of your brain is detecting areas of difficulty, but we're not really good consciously at subjectively detecting these, right? And it's really, again, we don't know which of these comes first, right? Do you perceive danger because your heart rate goes up? Or do your heart rate go up because you perceive danger? You have to be careful with that inference. Okay. Another thing, if we remember back to talking about attention and some of the studies we've done on attention, one of the ways that we study attention, remember, is by looking at your memory, right? With the basic idea that when you're focusing more attention on something, you remember it better, which is a undeniable fact. So one of the things that Groger and Chapman studied was, do people remember these threatening situations better? If you get them to drive through an intersection and their heart rate goes up, indicating they feel it's dangerous. If you later on you ask them about the details of the intersection or the maneuvers that they did there, will they remember them better? So what they had people do is drive through these. They showed them videos. Then they measured their heart rate and stuff, and then they showed different scenes, and they had to judge which ones they've seen before. Okay. Um, Drivers generally remember risky scenes better. Okay, but they also had kind of lots of false memories, right? Things that they were completely never experienced before. They said they saw before. So it doesn't seem like our memory is very good for this at all. Um, but a challenge with this, of course, is this is related to something we talk about using driving simulators with looking at cell phones, right? You're not really ever inducing a real sense of danger or risk in an experiment, right? People know watching a video they're not going to die, right? So they are these things really the really danger, or is it just difficulty, right? That's a really kind of hard thing to tease apart. People do remember, right? Their memory's better immediately after the drive. It kind of wanes, right? This has implications for testimony in court cases. People's memory for driving situations they think is like you think is photographic and lock solid, but the details you forget is quite large, right? Um, they usually the things people remember are the things they interact with, right? The actual intersection, the other vehicles. Okay, so the heart rate going up and the galvanic skin response seems to cause us to remember the central features better, okay? But we don't remember all the details. And I think I talked about this before. There used to be this kind of belief that people in really dangerous or threatening situations or emotionally arousing situations, people remember every detail. And the classic example when I was studying psychology was JFK's assassination. The more recent one people would probably point to is 9/11, right? When you heard about 9/11, people have the belief that they can remember every exact detail of that, where they were, what they were wearing, what they were eating. There, and I feel like I have that too, subjectively, honestly. But there's been research done where they've actually checked, right? So they actually have you where they can confirm it. They have people go back and say all the details of what they remembered, and then they checked, and what they found was that they're no more accurate than any everyday normal memory. Right? You don't have these flashbulb memories, even though you're emotionally aroused. There's some parts, the central features you remember a bit better, but not all the little details you think you remember. Okay, so that's kind of the perception of danger. A more effective thing that's come out, and there's actually this is part of the driving test in the UK. If you're in England, the driving test to get your license in UK is 1,000 times more difficult than it is in the US. I'll tell you, because they have a lot more road practical things on the road. They also have hazard perception tests. So in a hazard perception test, what we do is we watch a video, okay, and what you have the drivers do is press a button as soon as they detect a hazardous situation. So we're not detecting an accident, actually someone hitting another car. We detect a hazardous situation. Let me give you an example that I like to use from around here, right? When you're driving across 60, okay, Highway 60, and you're coming up to the 101 going north, right up to Scottsdale. Good drivers, right? If a good driver and you've driven it long enough, you realize that when you get there, when you're getting to there are people in the right lanes that are going to suddenly realize at the last second that they don't want to get off on the 101, right? Even though it's painted on the darn road, people still do that, right? They're going to suddenly go back over to 60 to stay on, right? And this happens lots of other intersections, but this is the one I always think of, right? So good drivers, right? Your hazard perception kicks in there and you're like, okay, I need to slow down. I'm going to move over, right? Because I'm perceiving that this is going to be dangerous. Nothing's actually happening yet, but I know from the context and my experience that this could be potentially hazardous, right? Then there's lots of other examples of this. So what they do is recreate these kind of scenarios and see if people they're measuring how well they can do it. And they could also do this at I used to work for the city of Phoenix, and we'd go around looking at intersections that have high accidents and kind of so you can see there's these kind of things. Okay. Um, Perception of this is most likely based on your kind of what's called a mental model, right? So over time, you develop a model of kind of experience you have with things, right? So over time, right, as you have experience, like when you're driving on a curved road and you know that there's a blind, there's a blind spot, these are things that you kind of can only get through experience driving after you get your license, almost, really. But you can do some of them in driver training. But this is kind of a hazard perception test, is shows that the main finding is more experienced drivers perceive more hazards, right? Um, Another thing that seems to be related to this, and this goes back to something we talked about when we're looking at steering, is where you look, kind of your visual, what's called your visual search strategy. Right? We saw steering ability. One of the fundamental features we saw when we're talking about steering is steering involves good drivers switch between looking at the near road right in front of their car and the far road, like the tangent point, right, to shift their gait. So their visual search strategy is to switch between these 2 points, whereas novices tend to look at the car just in front of them. Okay. If we look at visual search strategies, right? So this is an image. This is the person's visual search pattern, basically where their eyes went when they were looking at it. They can be quite complex, right? There can be a lot involved. Okay. The general finding is, though, that we tend to keep our eyes fixated longer on points of interest, right? And this was what was found in the steering research. People look at the tangent point of the curve, they fixate on it, they keep their eyes there longer because it's important, right, for steering. So with eye tracking, there's several different methods that can use. You can actually, very crude method is to measure the electrical signal from your eye muscles, right, which is called EOG. You can use glasses that basically shoot a light or something into your eye that reflect off your cornea, and they pick it up and they can do it. So there's a lot of different ways, and it's becoming more and more sophisticated. There's actually computer vision methods. So there's some, we've used these before, where you can put a camera in the car pointing at the driver's face, and you can pick up where they're looking by kind of doing their facial features, right? It's not super reliable, but it's another way. The advantage of that is they don't have to wear any glasses or anything on their face. Okay. So looking at visual search in driving, there's been a lot of search studies doing that. They looked at, for example, this is one of the earlier ones, looking at searching at traffic. So basically, they looked at how often people look at signs, different things in night and day. Okay. And what they found was that clutter, so the effect of clutter, the more in the environment, the more that you missed, right? You missed in the scene, because you can't really take it in all along. The effect for older drivers, right, for the effect of clutter was larger for younger drivers than for older drivers, right? Or younger drivers get more distracted by having lots in their environment. Okay. This is a real Crundle and Underwood. This is a really important study where they looked at novices and experienced drivers, their visual search. What they found is novice drivers tend to fixate on one thing, right? Novice drivers, this is another kind of related to the finding I talked about, looking right in front of your car. Experienced drivers scan more, okay? Novice drivers tend to look at one thing, the car right in front, right? Whereas experienced drivers go from the car in front to the back mirror to the side mirror. So they know. So a good example is, you're driving along and suddenly someone brakes in front of you. An experienced driver, because they've been scanning, they know from looking at their mirror a second ago that there's no car beside them. So they can go around the car suddenly if they have to. Whereas a less experienced driver, they're fixated on the car in front of them. The car brakes suddenly. They don't know whether they have less what we call situational awareness, right? Because they haven't been scanning the scene as much. They don't know whether it's safe to change lanes, so they smash into a car beside them, right? So there's these kind of big differences in visual search strategy that lead to these driving behaviors, right? Why does this occur, right? Why do novice drivers, less experienced drivers, just look at one thing and the thing right in front of them? One of them is, it could be an attentional capacity problem, right? So one of the things that, when you're learning to drive, maybe you have to focus so much on the actual driving, right? Steering, braking, right? If you're not a manual transmission, shifting gears, that you don't have enough attentional capacity left over to take in information from the outside world, right? So you're just too focused on your driving. Right. This is kind of analogous. Think of a kid dribbling a soccer ball or dribbling a basketball, right? When you first start out, you have to focus so much attention on just keeping the dribbling going that you're less aware of where your opponents are and where your teammates are. You don't have the attention left over. As you get more and more experienced, right, you don't need as much attention to keep the ball, dribble the ball. You can put more attention out there to the court. Same in driving, right? The less attention you need to actually steer and brake, the more you can put on the outside road. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is it's just a mental model problem. Maybe drivers don't have enough of a catalog of driving scenarios in their memory to know where to look and when, right? So the on-ramp example I gave, maybe following another car, drivers haven't learned that they need to check beside them, right? They just haven't had enough experience. So it's not a capacity issue. It's just learning kind of what you need to do in different situations. And so to address this, what they did was they presented they had videos, different kind of road, different hazardous events, and they looked at eye movements. Okay. What they did is they looked at kind of how long they fixated, how far they scanned. And what they found was that there wasn't just a general tendency to look around more. More experienced drivers tend to look more horizontally more in driving, unless it's a curved driving situation. They look more this way than vertically. Okay. So it really depended on the nature of how demanding it was. Okay. They looked at what was looked at most, right? You can see novices, things like parked cars. You can see that there's certain things, almost everything is looked at more by the experienced driver, right? So you can see the percentages. They're looking at everything more because they're moving their eyes around more, not just keeping their eyes fixated on one thing. Okay. What they found was that overall, they were able to conclude that it wasn't an attentional capacity a problem, because remember in the study, you're watching a video, right? So you're not actually steering anything. You're not braking. So there's no attention required for control of vehicles. You have all your attention available to look around the outside world, and we're still seeing these differences, okay? Drivers are not anticipating things. They don't know, novice drivers know where to look, right? And obviously, so experienced drivers learn through experience. You know where to scan and where to look and what to pick up in different driving scenarios. And obviously, this is going to have big implications for something we'll talk about later on, driver training, right? We're essentially throwing people on the road with a big hunk of metal going 80 miles an hour before they get these mental models, right? No way you're going to build up all this in a few hours of driver safety training, young driver training, right? So maybe we need to be doing something different, and we'll talk about that later on. Okay. This study, this will get into it. This gets into this a little bit, right? Can we actually train people to have better visual search? Okay. What they did in this study was actually showed novice drivers where their eyes were. So they had a video and they superimposed their eye movements on it, and they showed, oh, you're just looking in front all the time. They trained people. So they trained them, gave them cues of what to look at when they're in different driving scenarios. What they found was that they did show effects that can be improved. So your scanning patterns can be improved if you get this feedback. Obviously, this is takes a lot of fancy equipment and a long time, 6 months. So, but it has huge benefits. But whether we can do this, you roll this out practically in the real world is a big question. Okay. So that's kind of danger and drivers perceiving risk. Now I want to get into a really interesting theory of how people perceive risk and why people tend to be risky, right? And the idea is that it's what's called risk homeostasis theory, which is introduced by a person named Wild a long time ago. And the idea here is that every person has a set level of risk they're willing to tolerate, right? Almost like setting your air conditioning, right? Some people like it 78, some people like it 72, right? So everyone has a level of risk they're willing to tolerate, non-zero, right? And this is, when you're driving, right? A good example of where you see this is the time headway, right? How close you'll follow another vehicle. Some people are really tolerant of risks and follow super close, right? Your chance of getting in a rear end collision are much, much higher, but you're getting there faster, right? So people tolerate this. And the idea of risk homeostasis. So homeostasis means balance, baby, basically keeping your body in balance. Okay. And what risk homeostasis argues is that anytime you make a situation more or less risky, people are going to adjust to keep the balance the same. Okay. So it's almost like this is an example of what's called a behavioral adaptation, because it kind of works like a thermostat, right? So people have a target level of risk. They perceive the risk. If it's lower than their target, they change their driving behavior, right? So if this situation is really not giving is risk perceived risky to me, I drive a bit faster or drive a bit closer, right? And this implies, and there's been some evidence to support this, that any kind of safety intervention a lot of the safety interventions we do are going to be consumed by the change in drivers' behavior, right? Um, so what will happen is, for example, a good example of this is driving around a really dangerous curve. So imagine we have a curve going up the side of one of the mountains around here that's super curvy and dangerous. One of the ways, so people say they drive around it normally 40 miles an hour. One of the things that you think you could do to make it safer is to straighten it out, right? So let's carve some out of the rock so it's not as sharp of curves. What can tend to happen, and what often happens when you do that, is people just drive faster, right? Now they drive 60 miles around it because they're balancing their risk, right? You made it less risky so they can drive it faster. So this predicts that when drivers are aware of the changes, right, the they'll be consumed, and they're going to be no net benefit because they're going to be just as many accidents because people are just driving faster now, right? So what we want to do in this case is, instead of we want to make changes that people are not aware of, right? So if you had, the big light standards that hold the lights on the highway, one of the things we could do is make those, and some of these is breakaway. So when you hit them, they're not as solid, right? They collapse easier. You could also make breakaway barriers depending on, what you want to keep people from. So those things, they make things more safe because you're not hitting it as hard, but the driver is completely unaware that they're there. You can't see from the outside that it's a breakaway barrier or post. So those are not going to change people's perception of risk. So that's kind of some of the ideas from this. Okay. So drivers that are invisible to drivers is what we want to see. Okay. Um, the the kind of evidence for this is a bit mixed of risk homeostasis theory. People argue, people aren't really accurate, as we saw at the start of today's lecture. They're not really accurate at perceiving risk in the first place. So how are we going to keep it balanced like that? So it'd be like trying to keep your home cooled at 75 when you have a really terrible thermostat that's not good at sensing it. Okay. Um, and it predicts, right, that the accident rate should be constant, right? Because, for example, in the winter, people should perceive that the roads, or when it rains more, people should be perceived that things are more risky. They should slow down, follow further back. So the accident rate should stay the same, even though the conditions have gone up. The danger of the conditions has gone up. But we know that there's seasonal variations in accidents rate, so the accident rate doesn't stay constant. So the bottom line is, there's something like this. There's some evidence of things getting consumed, right? Another thing that gets consumed in an interesting way is traffic, and you've probably experienced this yourself. So what happens often in roads around here is you have a 4-lane highway, 2 lanes each way. I live out, east. It starts to get traffic gets crazy because more people work out that start to live out there. Traffic gets really backed up and jammed. So what they do is they add another lane, right? Um, what happens is, very quickly that other lane gets consumed, and it's back to the traffic jams you always had. The reason is, right, having 4 lanes, the bad traffic problem, people were doing other things, right? They were, in different cities, maybe not here, taking public transportation, light rail, carpooling. Once you opened it up and made it better, people stopped doing those things, right? They start driving themselves. They stop taking the light rail because, there's 6 lanes now. So things are being absorbed by the change in behavior of people, right? This is why traffic engineering and transportation and all these things, you always have to take humans into account. The humans are going to do things that foil your plans. And so in risk homeostasis, we do see that when you make changes like lane width, um, so when you increase the width of lanes, that makes roads safer, right? You're less likely to go out of your lane and hit someone. But we find that people speed up, right? When you pave the shoulder, people speed up. It's not completely absorbed. So overall, these things do reduce accidents. So there's some evidence of people behaviorally adapting, but not complete homeostasis is the bottom line. Why do people like risks? I think we talked about this already a little bit. There's this personality trait called sensation seeking, to seeking these kinds of sensations. Some people like the sensation of going fast and the feel that you might go off the road, right? Sounds crazy, but people like that. That's the kind of the feeling we get. Ideally, we could give that to people other places, right? In a video game or a driving simulator, not on the real road. Okay. So you kind of almost get a high and there's a personality that if on the web, if you search sensation seeking, you can see whether you probably know whether you are or not anyway. Okay. The last thing I want to get into is kind of the other emotions in driving. Okay. One of the things that really I would recommend if you're interested in emotional kind of things is read the book by, I think it's Elizabeth Barrett Cohen, her name is, How Emotions Are Made. Okay. And the idea is that what emotion is an interpretation of physiological arousal, right? So we get aroused, our heart rate goes up. It's not the other way around. We don't get angry, then our rate goes up. Our heart rate goes up for some reason, then we interpret it as being angry, right? So it's other way around. And so we can see, and I'll give you some examples of that later on. So there are ways, and people are using that camera. We can detect motions from facial recognition now. So people have been using that. Um, there's no real gender differences in terms of driving, anger, and aggression, surprisingly, in the research has shown in terms of horn honking. Um, Women tend to gauge more in mildly aggressive behaviors, whereas men, the ones that get out of the car and yell at each other and things like that, road rage, right? Um, a lot of people, obviously, this has kind of changed over the years, how much people care about road rage and aggression. It kind of waxes and wanes, I find it. But in the late 90s was identified as a big problem. Okay. Um, a lot of people argue that, what's happening here is really frustration, right? So drivers are getting frustrated through, people, traffic jams, not being able to get what they want, where they want, these kind of things. So that's what we need to kind of look at. Okay. Um, very little, one of the things that actually people have proposed is more communication between vehicles, right? Kind of the anonymity of driving, being able to, honk at someone without them knowing who you are, and over things has kind of, people argued, makes people more aggressive. Just like you see online with social media, kind of the not having to confront someone face to face makes people troll more, that kind of idea. Okay. They looked at, or Shinar's done some really interesting research on people's frustration, aggression, and driving, waiting time, having to wait, the longer delays at lights are what tends to make people really aggressive and frustrated in driving. They want to get to places. I don't know why, because you just go home and watch TV a lot of the time. Why you're such a hurry to get to there 10 minutes faster, who knows? But that's, again, the nature of where we're human beings, and we have to accept that. Okay, that's it for today's lecture on risk perception in driving. Thank you.